Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wendy Sir. I'm a senior researcher at American Institutes for Research, and we are so pleased to have you join us today for today's webinar, Looking Under the Hood of Competency-Based Education. This is a nice chance for all of us to take an hour away from the election madness and talk about a topic that I know is of interest to a great many of you here today. I am so fortunate to be joined today by several members of our research team from our study. Jill Walston, who was the principal investigator for the study, Catherine Bitter, who was the project director for phase 1 of the study, Christina Zeisser, our lead methodologist, Lauren Clymer, our research associate, and we have some other AIR staff members who are helping to organize today's event. Deirdre Tomlinson, who is our tech guru, and Cora Goldston, our communication specialist. I also want to acknowledge the Nellie Mae Education Foundation who funded this study, and I know that Eve Goldberg will be joining us today. She's the Director of Research. We have other staff members from Nellie Mae who will also be joining us. This study was conducted in 3 different states, and we are so fortunate today to have 2 of our state partners, Paul Leather, Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Education in New Hampshire. Paul, do you want to say a quick hello?
Hello, everyone.
And Ryan Krohn, Director for the Institute for Personalized Learning.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Great. Welcome, Ryan and Paul. And just a reminder to all presenters, make sure both your computer and your phones are muted when you're not presenting. That will be helpful to everyone for our audio. So just a quick overview of today's hour. We'll be spending about a half an hour talking briefly about competency-based education and highlighting some of the findings and also our process for conducting our study. And then we are going to be hearing from Paul Leather and Ryan Krohn to share some reflections on the study. What were the surprises or confirmations, or what are the implications for the findings from this study for the work that they're engaged in their various states. We will have a short time at the end. This is only an hour, but we will have a short time at the end for folks to either pose questions or to write in questions in the chat box. So a few little housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be 60 minutes. We'll be ending at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, and it is being recorded. We will be posting a copy of this recording on the Deeper Learning website, and we'll also be sending out to anyone who's registered for today's event. Cora Goldston will be putting the website link in the chat box so that you can all access that. I imagine that the recording will be up within a day or 2. We also have provided for you a copy of today's PowerPoint and a copy of the study of competency-based education, looking under the hood of competency-based education, over to the right under the downloadable files. It's a pod over to the right of your slides. Then we have about 60 members or participants who are here to join us today. So you can chat with one another through the group chat, or if you'd like to pose a question to one of our presenters or our guest speakers, please use the Q&A function up at the top right of your screen. If you're experiencing any tech issues, please also note those in the Q&A section, and Deirdre or Cora will assist you in resolving any of your tech issues. So we're going to start with a poll, and I'm hoping, Deirdre, you can just bring up the poll so we can find out who's here today. If everyone can take a moment and indicate what kind of role you play in the field, and then just how much experience you already have with competency-based education. How much do you already know? Well, I can see we have a research heavy audience here today. That's fantastic. And also a lot of folks with a great deal of expertise. Why don't we just take a few more minutes for everyone to respond to the 2 poll questions? Great. All right, Deirdre, let's end the poll. It looks like many of our participants here today come from the research world and have either some knowledge or quite a bit of knowledge about competency-based ed. So we can move quickly through our first few slides. So it seems that everyone here is pretty familiar with the term competency-based ed, which is founded on a pretty simple idea that children and youth are, it's better for us to measure their learning through their demonstrated competency than just simply through a time-based system where credit is awarded based on how long a student has been participating in a classroom or completing assignments. Now, INACOL and CCSSO have done a recent scan, and 42 states across the U.S. are in some phase of either planning, piloting, or implementing CBE. So this is a very rapidly growing trend. But despite its popularity and its the growing interest in this area, there's actually relatively little rigorous research that's looked at the effects of CBE on students. And there's also not a lot of consensus in terms of what we mean by the term CBE. So one of the first questions that our research team tried to address was, what do we mean by CBE? What does it look like in the classroom? We started out approaching this question by looking at the kinds of definitions that many of the folks on the call have been involved in developing. We have partners at CCSSO and INACOL who have developed definitions of what they mean by CBE. Many of the states around the country that have been engaged in CBE work have posed their own definitions. We also went out and spoke to school leaders from schools that identified as CBE schools to find out what were the key features they associated with the CBE approach. Now, number one, recognition of learning is what I just mentioned as sort of one of the more common features of CBE, that students receive credit based on their demonstrated learning rather than their seat time. And often folks associate CBE with having flexible pacing. But what we also uncovered as part of our search on exploring the meaning of CBE was several other features, and we came up with these 6 features that you can see on your screen here. So one of the key areas was learning targets, that they're clear and explicit to students, that students really understand what's expected of them. Many of the folks that we spoke to and that we saw in our scan of definitions of CBE talked about how CBE is associated with a personalized learning approach, where each student is given personalized support to be able to support that learning. Assessment, and I know Paul has a lot to say on this topic, and one of the key things we discovered about CBE was more flexibility and choice about when and how they show learning, and I know Paul has a lot to say about what kinds of learning tasks and demonstrations of learning are associated with the CBE approach. And then lastly, there are many folks in the CBE world who believe that if it's about learning, then it shouldn't matter where and when that learning takes place. So expanded opportunities for students to learn outside of the school schedule and the school building, and opportunities to earn credit for those kinds of experiences. A second key question that our research team had to tackle before we could get started with our study was to think about, what's the theory? How is it that we think that CBE benefits students? And I'm assuming that most of us on the call today would argue that CBE is something positive. It's a way that students can gain greater academic competency. But we needed to sort of uncover the black box of what we mean by CBE and how we believe it contributes to student success. So as you can see on the screen, our theory was that when a school embraces a CBE label, that the teachers in classrooms will be changing their practices. They'll be setting more clear and higher expectations for students, combined with flexibility and the opportunity for students to take more responsibility and ownership over their learning. Those experiences, those changed experiences for students, we theorized, and this was based on some reviews of the research, would lead to increased or enhanced learning capacities on the part of students, changes in their mindsets and dispositions, changes in their self-regulated learning skills, and changes in their academic behavior. And again, through our research scan, we hypothesized that it was the mechanism of those improved learning capacities that would help students to gain greater progress with their academics. I'm going to turn this over to Catherine Bitter for a moment to tell you a little bit about the design of the study. Catherine was the founding project director for the study. So Catherine, go ahead and advance to the next slide and share with folks some features of the design of our study.
Thank you, Wendy. So the goal of our competency-based education study, which was funded by the Nellie Mae Education Foundation and took place over 2 years, from January 2014 to December 2015, was twofold. First, to describe the types of instructional practices and policies used in schools that are implementing CBE and how they compare to those used in more traditional environments. And then secondly, to examine the relationships between students' CBE experiences and changes in their learning capacities in the areas of academic mindset, self-regulated learning, and academic behaviors. So to address these goals, we designed a study that would allow us to collect data on practices and policies from administrators, teachers, and students, both in schools considered implementers of CBE and matched comparison schools, and would also allow us to look at change in students' self-reported learning capacities over the course of one school year. So specifically, we collected data from 10 public high schools identified as CBE implementers by state education administrators and local administrators. The schools were located across 3 states participating in CCSSO's Innovation Lab Network, so New Hampshire, Wisconsin, and Kentucky. And then we also collected data from 8 comparison high schools that were generally similar demographically and located in similar regions to the CBE schools in the study. So we collected data at 2 time points in the 2014-15 school year. First, in order to measure change in students' learning capacities over time, we administered a student survey to 9th graders in a subset of 4 CBE and 4 comparison schools in fall and spring of the 2014-15 school year. This survey addressed learning capacities that we believe most aligned with the goals of CBE, including, as we said, academic mindsets and dispositions, self-regulated learning skills, and academic behaviors. And in a minute, Lauren Clymer will be providing some more details about the development of this survey. Then, to gather information on students' experiences related to CBE, we supplemented the spring student survey with questions related to their CBE experiences in school. And in addition, to collect information on teachers' instructional practices and CBE-related structures within schools and classrooms, we developed surveys for core content teachers and administrators, which we administered in the full sample of 18 schools in spring 2015. So in total, we collected data from approximately 250 teachers and 30 school administrators across the 18 schools, and a little over 1,000 students completed both the pre- and post-student surveys. Our response rates were generally in the 70 to 80% range. And then to complete the analyses, we also collected student demographic and achievement background data from district and state systems, which we'll talk about when we get into the analysis. So for now, I'm going to hand it over to Lauren Clymer, who's going to talk a bit about the survey development process.
Thanks, Catherine. So the student, teacher, and administrative surveys are a key part of our study. So I'd like to share just a little bit about how we develop these instruments. I'm going to start with the student survey, and you'll see a sample on your screen now. So there are 2 main parts of the student survey. To develop the first part of the student survey, which asks students about their learning capacities, we first reviewed relevant literature and resources of CBE practices to identify the expected outcomes associated with CBE practices. We then conducted a search to locate existing survey instruments designed to measure these outcome areas of interest. We modified these existing instruments to create a series of scales to measure students' academic mindsets and dispositions, self-regulated learning skills, which would be some strategies students use to engage in and complete learning tasks, and their academic behaviors, such as preparation, engagement, and effort in their coursework. For example, under the domain of academic mindsets and dispositions, students responded to questions regarding their sense of belonging, academic self-efficacy, intrinsic motivation, and locus of control. To develop the second part of the survey, which asked students to describe their experiences in their classes, we first did an extensive review of the literature to identify the 6 CBE features that Wendy mentioned earlier. We then obtained input and reviews from our state partners and other key stakeholders to finalize our CBE measurement areas. We then developed original student survey questions in each of these 6 areas. A critical part of our development included cognitive interviews at CBE schools in each of the states and 1 non-CBE school locally. Overall, we conducted 16 student cognitive interviews. In these interviews, we asked some specific questions, such as, when you hear the term learning goals, what does this mean to you? Or can you tell me about the learning goals you had in mind when you answered these questions? And we also asked some general questions, such as, were there any questions in this section that you thought were confusing or that you had to read more than once to understand? Surveys were revised and refined several times following each round of cognitive interviews. We also developed surveys for both teachers and administrators based on the 6 areas of CBE I just discussed. And on your screen, you'll see a sample survey, teacher survey question. For teachers, the surveys asked them to respond to questions across the 6 CBE feature areas at multiple levels, including school-wide policies and practices across the courses that they teach, and policies and practices for one specific course. For administrators, the survey includes questions related to school-wide practices and policies. Similar to the student surveys, we conducted cognitive interviews with both teachers and administrators in the 3 states. And these included some questions such as, were there any questions in this section that did not make sense in the context of your classroom or school? Again, we revisited and revised the teacher and administrator survey several times in response to this feedback. And now I'm going to turn it over to Chrissy Zeitzer, who's going to tell you a little bit about the approach we used to examine the survey responses.
Thanks, Lauren. Chris, are you all set?
Yes, thanks, Lauren. So the first step to analyzing the teacher survey data was to
confirm. My name is Rachel Trumbull, and I just made a reservation. I just have I have a question for you. Could you check? I'll give you the reservation code. I just want. Okay. Could you check to see if there is an earlier flight on my return on the 17th? Yeah.
Could you please mute your phone if you, if everybody else could,
yeah, would you do that
continue
for me? Because, yeah.
Rachel, can you please mute your phone?
Okay. Okay, and
okay. I think we're going to continue talking about the analytic approach for the teacher survey. So the first step that we followed was to confirm that the sets of survey items that we intended to use as survey scales could in fact be grouped together to measure the CBE features that were discussed earlier. And we did this by using exploratory factor analysis, as well as calculating the Cronbach's alpha to make sure that these survey items grouped together as we had intended. We then used t-tests to examine whether there were differences between the teacher survey responses of the teachers in the CBE schools and teachers in the comparison schools to determine if the differences were statistically significant. And finally, we looked at the distribution of the responses from teachers, both between schools and within schools, to look at the amount of variation in teacher responses. Overall, many of the findings of our study followed what we would expect, where teachers in CBE settings were more likely to report specific CBE features than teachers in comparison schools, such as meeting with students one-on-one to discuss learning targets, as well as to discuss students' progress toward meeting these goals. Also, the teachers in CBE schools were more likely to report that students were required to demonstrate proficiency in order to earn course credit, and that there was more flexibility in retaking assessments and or being able to demonstrate competency in alternative ways. the teachers in CBE schools had greater use of technology and were more likely to use personalized learning plans for all students. And also they reported a greater amount of flexibility in the pacing for students. There were some key areas, however, where we expected to see differences between teachers in CBE schools and comparison schools, but we actually didn't find a significant difference. Some of these include using traditional measures when assigning final grades, so traditional measures such as final exams, end of course unit exams, the use of formative and interim assessments, the expectation that students would be responsible for tracking their own learning and progress, having opportunities for students to conduct independent studies or making presentations to peers, and also the use of other non-traditional summative assessments such as papers, presentations, or portfolios. And so again, these were differences where we expected to see perhaps the use of more non-traditional summative assessments among teachers in CBE schools, but in fact we didn't find a difference between schools labeled as CBE and schools that were comparison schools. Overall, we believe that we were not able to find significant differences between teachers in CBE and comparison settings for some of these features because there was a substantial amount of variation within the schools within our sample. So for example, in a school there might be more flexible pacing among students in math courses, but not so much in the science courses. Or there might be different types of assessments in a science course, but in a math course they were more likely to use the more traditional measures. Overall, we found that rather than implementing all of the CBE features within the CBE schools, we found that a lot of the CBE schools were still participating in many of the traditional ways of measuring student performance, but also adding on some of the CBE features. And so one reason that some of our findings were unexpected and we did not observe the differences was because the large amount of variation within schools and the fact that not only were many of the traditional practices being used in CBE schools, but many of the teachers in the comparison schools were also implementing some features that we traditionally think of as CBE. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation back to Wendy, who will discuss the student survey analyses.
Thanks, Chrissy. So very interestingly, as Chrissy just described, yes, we found a number of areas where teachers were reporting that their practices were different from traditional settings, but also a lot of areas where there really wasn't a lot of difference. And as you recall from Catherine's portion and from Lauren's presentation, one of our questions, of course, was how are students experiencing CBE in the classroom? So, that was obviously, we were kind of holding our breath to find out what kinds of differences would we find. And in fact, there were a couple of areas where students who attended schools that are labeled as CBE did report differences. These two key areas were having a personalized learning plan, and this is for all students, not just students who maybe are struggling academically, and having regular opportunities to meet with an adult just to talk about their learning. So that was an indication that yes, maybe some changes were being experienced by students. However, all of the other areas that we tried to capture within our surveys that looked at the nature of a student's experiences in the classroom showed little to no difference between students in CBE and comparison schools. Now we attribute that, as Chrissy was talking about, to the wide variation that we were finding in teacher practices within schools, and this was particularly the case in schools that were identifying as CBE. So the research team decided to pose a different question. As you recall from Lauren's portion of the presentation, another part of our student surveys was looking at students' learning capacities, their mindsets and dispositions, their self-regulated learning skills, and their academic behaviors. And as Catherine explained, we then looked at pre-post changes in those learning capacities. So we asked questions in the fall, and then we asked them again in the spring and determined how much change or positive shift did we see in some of these learning capacities. So the research team, given that we weren't really seeing differences in students' experiences depending on the school they attended, decided to ask a different question. And that question was, how are students' learning capacities influenced when they report experiencing features that we normally associate with CBE, regardless of the school that they attend? Aha, so better news here. We did find some really great associations. Now there's an arrow at the bottom and many researchers on the call, so I hope you associate this bidirectional arrow as indicating that we used a correlational approach to look at associations between students' reports of experiencing specific features associated with CBE. So in this case, students who talked about having clear learning targets, really understanding what was expected of them, showed positive changes in their intrinsic motivation and self-management, for example. Students who reported that they believed there were clear expectations that they had to demonstrate their learning in order to earn credit for a course also showed positive changes in their self-efficacy, their cognitive control, and their intrinsic motivation. Students who reported that they were given more flexibility around pacing, so for instance, if I need more time, I can take more time, were more likely to show positive changes in their self-efficacy and in their intrinsic motivation. These are just a few of the examples of the many associations that we found, and I encourage you, as I mentioned earlier, there's a copy of our final report on the screen, so anyone who's interested in seeing the many ways in which students' reports of experiencing specific CBE features were associated with positive changes in their learning capacities can take a look at that report. So what was our takeaway as researchers? Clearly, there's some promising evidence that when students report experiencing specific features that we associate with CBE, we were seeing evidence that perhaps there are positive changes in their learning capacities. And we know from the research review that we conducted as part of the initial part of the study that those kinds of learning capacities are linked to long-term academic gains for students. We also found that clearly embracing a CBE label is just not enough, that there's no guarantee if a school calls themselves CBE that their classroom experience is going to be any different than the classroom experiences of students in traditional schools. So that led us to conclude that one of the most important takeaways from the study for us is that schools that are interested in embracing a CBE approach need to be much more careful and gauge and monitor how those practices are making their way to the classroom and whether or not students are really experiencing differences or changes in the nature of those classroom experiences. Now, as fascinating as our takeaways as researchers are, we are actually much more interested in hearing directly from our partners and those in the field who are doing the CBE work every day. So I would like to invite Paul Leather, who is the Deputy Commissioner for the New Hampshire Department of Education, to share a few reflections and a little introduction to their work in New Hampshire. So Paul, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, I really appreciate having an opportunity to speak to this report, which is entirely consistent with our own findings. We've been working at competency education for several decades here in New Hampshire, and what we have found is very consistent with what you have found in this study, which is that district, school, and classroom practice can vary dramatically, and most particularly at the school and classroom level, and that it's not enough to just say that we're all implementing competency education and to have a definition that everyone is apparently ascribed to. It's more important to really look at to see what's going on between students and adults in terms of teaching and learning. And so what we have found is that if there is students have choice, voice, and agency, really greater ownership of their learning and of the competencies that they're expected to demonstrate, as well as clear and rigorous expectations for all students and supports for all students, and where not just academic content, but also those skills and dispositions that are necessary for success are assessed through complex performance, through authentic tasks, that we have seen quality of both the delivery and the learning in competency education improve. This is why we've implemented really a kind of a different system. We've moved from 2005, where we essentially mandated competency education for all New Hampshire schools, to implementing a system called New Hampshire PACE, or Performance Assessed Education, which is really a system where there is an expectation of rich performance tasks being delivered, where those tasks are calibrated in terms of what proficiency means across schools and across educators and across students, and where there are common tasks that are developed by educators for calibration purposes, and where there is substantial professional development provided and practiced even before folks join the overall process, and where there are supportive networks across the state's districts and across schools, and particularly within schools around professional learning communities, where educators and students look at student work, which is through that process moves to a much more rich and deep kind of student work, which is tied to student expectation, and that's crucial to the improvement process of education. We really ascribe to the instructional core model that Dick Elmore has talked about for a number of years, where change must be directly connected to student learning and educator capacity. And so that we have essential elements like partnerships between the state and the local level. And I think when we hear from Ryan, we'll hear more about kind of regional partnerships between schools and educators. But we, in New Hampshire, a small state, we are creating networks of schools, districts, and educators that are in partnership, and really there's a sense of ownership at the local level. This year, we're focusing more on a greater emphasis around both project-based learning and the developmental skills and dispositions, and we also are focusing more on individual student pacing, really a personalized model, which has not been a major feature in most New Hampshire schools up until this time, and so we have actually turned our sights to what's going on in Wisconsin, and have learned a lot from the work that Ryan and others have been doing in the CISA 1 project in Wisconsin. I'm going to stop there, and we can talk about questions relative to New Hampshire a little later, but I'm going to turn it over to Ryan now.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ryan Krohn, and I'm the director of the Institute for Personalized Learning. I'll give a quick little... Can everybody hear that? I hope. Okay, again, I'm Ryan Krohn. I'm the director of the Institute for Personalized Learning. And prior to coming into this role over the last couple of months, I was a district administrator and district principal, looking in our region to putting some of the work of competency-based education forward. But I consider myself a big client of the Institute. So just to frame for you as an audience what the Institute is, the Institute was developed here in Wisconsin as a part of a regional call by our superintendents for a need and a paradigm shift for education. And one of the main elements at that paradigm shift was really a shift here in Wisconsin to move to more of a learner-centered system, or competency-based education as being a part of that, our students demonstrating proficiencies and moving that. So there was a regional call for this type of work, and since that time in 2010, a number of the way we've designed our program is a number of schools and school districts and teachers have taken some of the core ideas around here and sort of developed their own iteration or their own design cycle to go about doing this in their schools and classrooms. We've been pretty fortunate in this area, as many states are, as they have a lot of teachers and principals and practitioners see value in this work, and because of that we have some unique models that are 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 years old that we're seeing different storylines evolve. So I was really fascinated with the research that's been coming here as we started and some of the findings, because I have a local interpretation, local stories, and it's great to see how the work has come around. But just to frame something quick for our audience as to what we're seeing, for the most part, if we began with looking at competency-based education taking off in our classrooms, one of the things that we asked our teams to do was to think intentionally about the teaching and learning practices that would most likely drive that forward, whether that was around certain type of assessment practices or feedback practices, whether it's about personal learning goals or other pieces like that. And we asked them to take not only those practices, but to be really, really clear on the intent of those practices as to what were they trying to develop in terms of those personal success skills or learner independence skills or 21st century skills, whatever we would call them, to be very intentful about that was one of the goals behind this work. So again, to start with that, Wisconsin looked at this as a change strategy of if we're going to be looking at bringing competency-based education forward, what practices would we be employing in our classrooms or across our schools? And then more importantly, what was the intent of deploying those practices? We have really pushed on, a 10,000-foot view that if those practices were designed to nurture powerful learners, or if those practices were there to build the capacity in those learners to learn, or even lastly, if those practices would position students as a co-designer of their learning where they'd have shared accountability for success, that we thought that those two pieces would work hand in hand together in terms of the teaching practices that we were intentionally bringing forward, but really the intent that we wanted that the student would take on these new roles and responsibilities for their work. So as we saw in some of the findings about students having, for example, learning plans or meeting more frequently with an adult, as Wendy talked about just a little bit ago about how clear learning targets showed some connections with intrinsic motivation, or how students felt like they had a greater self-efficacy or intrinsic motivation. That was kind of our goal in doing this work, that we would have that be an intent. As much as the content or the competency was there, we wanted to make sure that the intent there of developing, nurturing learners and building their capacity to learn was part of our outcomes. There's some schools here that I'll reference here a little bit because they're pretty unique. One of them is called the Flight Academy, and the Flight Academy stands for Facilitated Learning Through Independence, Guidance, High Expectations, and Technology. It was a school that was started by 2 educators. There's now up to 5 educators working in this school as a team. And it's a school within a school, so you get a chance to really do some comparison of students that are in a competency-based education world versus maybe those that are in a more traditional setting. But what we found in that school, and what's interesting, is that school is designed around 3 questions. They ask students, what are you going to learn? They ask them, how are you going to learn it? And they ask them finally, how are you going to show it? So 100% of their lifestyle in this school is designed around really needing to understand the competencies that or the proficiencies that they're going to need to be able to demonstrate. They even have control of how they're going to learn that material and how they would show their evidence. And that takes place as well as one of the major findings of not only having plans to do that work, but even more importantly, that they regularly meet with teachers in a conferring or one-on-one model as a part of the environment versus maybe traditional meetings. I bring that example up because it's an example that really flipped the role of the learner and the role of the educator upside down, which was really the only way to sort of find success in this environment was to truly have learners take on the role of being a co-designer or seeing themselves as really having shared commitment to their own success in that school. And as the educators have continued to involve in there, they have found that the only way that it really is possible for them to be providing, or I was about to say providing instruction, but really that's a limit. It's a different tone there. Setting up the learning environment. Really, the only way they've been able to do that is to truly think of those practices that do engage learners with a different role. So, again, back to the Institute. When we started in 2010, it was teachers like this that were seeing the value of competency-based education and seeing that that was the main currency or outproduct of their work, and that they would try to design systems around this. Since then, I mentioned Flight as being one, but there is, we work with about 70 local districts here in Wisconsin or in neighboring states that are doing this work. And for the most part, most of the projects that are going here are shifted on individual teachers, teacher teams, or schools that have decided to take this on. One of the big pieces that we've seen, in addition to some of the teaching and learning practices that we've seen, is that the last layer is structures and policies that are changing here that are really getting out of the way of a traditional system to really allow students to move forward. So for the most part in Wisconsin, our model, similar to other models, we have an equation that is usually run, which is one teacher with 28 kids for 52 minutes, 6 classes a day, 5 days a week, 180 days in the school year. But for the most part, Flight and the other STEM Academy and a number of other schools that are here, they've changed all of those variables, in a way that really allows them to understand the role of the teacher, the role of the learner, but where you see minutes changing now and time is no longer a constant, but time is a variable where learning is designed to be the constant. You also see spots where students are not progressing in a course in a traditional 5 days a week, 180 school days. You see them, it's more based on mastery, and you're seeing more and more evidence of that in structures and policies now where students are no longer being awarded credit for seat time, but for mastery, or where courses are even being designed around the flexible nature of learning, whether that's just flexing the time or flexing the duration of the course. Last but not least, I heard the term a couple of times earlier on, wide variation, which I thought was a really interesting piece as the initial study looked at this wide variation. And it's something that we're seeing here throughout our state or with the districts we're working with, is this wide variation in terms of the practices, the quality of the practices, the implementation level of the practice. You have some people just starting this work who are a couple of weeks in versus others that have been doing this for 4 or 5 years. What we have tried to center on that variation was a deep understanding of why they're doing the practices in the first place and how many pieces of exposure do students need to have until they really start to develop these skills. We've worked a little bit with UW-Madison's research team on this over the last couple of years, but what we've been studying is that variation and the quality indicators that could go with these practices, but even more importantly is the type of exposure that students need until they truly take on some of these roles that sort of the learner independence roles and the co-designer roles that really then start to work with the educator in fueling a cycle of learning that we depend on students having those skills as we design learning environments versus as we're developing them. And there's a real difference in those two that we're seeing as schools that are just starting this don't reap a lot of the benefits until those practices are really an instrumental part of the experience. But when they do become an instrumental part, what we're seeing informally here throughout Wisconsin is that really does change the nature of the learning experience and hence really pushes forward the power of the competency-based education as students take on greater control. So I will maybe wrap up my piece as well. I feel like I'm threw a number of things out there, but can turn it back over to the facilitation team or any questions.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Ryan, I'm just curious, it sounds like there were a lot of confirmations in the study findings. Any surprises or implications for the work that you're doing in Wisconsin related to these study findings?
I do think it directly aligns with how what you had shared in the beginning here, which is there is a wide variation in terms of what people are defining as competency-based education, or even in particular what some of their goals are. We have worked with schools that were focused on competency-based education, but they really hadn't paid much attention to the shift in roles that's required for an educator or for a learner. And in those places, they were maybe focused more on reaching proficiency, where other places we have seen that they were really focused on the role of the learner as the centerpiece of this work, and seeing that as then an eventual driver of them continuing to learn and meet the proficiencies. At the same time, again, the quality piece. So our next iteration around is really going to be looking at helping to define some rubrics and quality indicators for particular practices, as well as trying to link some of those practices in terms of quality or quantity of exposure opportunities for students to really kind of coincide with the development of some of these skills or attributes that, whether it's intrinsic motivation or self-efficacy. For example, how often do students have to be exposed to goal setting to become, to benefit from the individual ownership of that goal in terms of their learning?
Thanks, Ryan. Paul, I know you've had a number of participants pose questions directly to you, and I'm wondering if maybe you can take a moment and share, first of all, were there any surprises in our study findings? And then if you could address a couple of the participants' questions verbally, that would be great.
Yes, I didn't think actually that there were too many surprises. I do think that your core findings that there were very different expectations across schools and very different kinds of implementation going on across schools. We've found that as well, and we believe that's an artifact of the whole problem of coming out of No Child Left Behind, where every school and district was expected to do exactly the same thing, and after a while people started to ignore that and started to ignore state level expectations in a sense, and went about what they were doing, and also recognized that accountability and assessment and all of that was really way too far from the classroom, which was your third finding. And so we needed to create a system that was much closer to teaching and learning. In terms of the specific questions, I think Mandy asked questions about specific professional development and resources for competency education. What I didn't mention earlier is that we've developed kind of a tiered system of supports for our districts. The first tier is for those who are really just starting to implement competency education, so we provide technical assistance and a number of supports on our New Hampshire network, and I can provide some of that information to the conveners of this webinar so that can be sent out. As part of that, we even have online courses for folks to on both leadership around competency education and change processes, as well as just implementing competency education as well. And we've also focused a great deal on implementing project-based learning, implementing team teaching, implementing multi-classroom arrangements, implementing personalized learning planning, and implementing methods that will enhance student agency, choice, and voice in the process. So, you know, there are obviously many factors that need to take place to really change the student environment to being more student-centered, and so we really focus on that in that first tier. In the second tier, we're particularly focused on professional development around complex performance tasks and providing instruction to teams of educators around constructing performance tasks, scoring performance tasks, calibration of performance tasks, since this system is actually an assessment and accountability system. I'm interested in the finding that in the study that talks about choice and voice in assessment, and we are looking at approaching that, but we haven't quite yet figured out how to build that and hold ourselves accountable to it. So I'm interested in knowing more about where folks might be with that. We had a second question around thoughts about funding for personalized PACE in terms of overall student funding. I would just say that what we're attempting to implement are cost-neutral methods of personalization. And again, as I mentioned, drawing from some of the learnings that our compatriots in Wisconsin have accomplished, where they are doing this in public schools with public school staff, but really reorganizing how teaching and learning is going on and putting more expectations in the hands of students in a classroom or a learning environment where there are many more opportunities for learning that are paced by students and really evaluated by students along the way. So we are trying to stay away from kind of costing out how this might be a more expensive approach, and really trying to find ways to scale personalization within our current costs.
Thank you so much, Paul. I believe we have someone from our participant list that would like to pose a question directly. Kim, do you want to unmute yourself and try posing your question? And please introduce yourself. All right, well, maybe that didn't work. While we're waiting for Kim to unmute, Ryan, do you want to talk a little bit about the professional learning opportunities that you've developed in Wisconsin at the Institute?
Yeah, really at the heart of our work has been designing professional development support for educators. And when we first started, everything that we did was labeled Getting Started. This was about looking at your current design and finding an entry point in your practice that might have been a little bit more student-centered or focused on learning, and trying to find kind of a path from your current practice and practices that started to overlap with really positioning students in a position to learn. Since that time, those practices continue to evolve from students who are, or staff and teachers who are getting started, to where they're doing a little bit more iteration and redesign of their work, and even possibly here across the region with some schools and districts that are looking at bringing this full scale and really looking at systemic change. But for the most part, our model, imagine a two-tiered model. The first part really being around leadership and designing a strategic framework for positioning this shift. This is a complex shift in our system, as we're all aware on this call, as everybody has background with the work of competency-based education. But as a system or a school or a teacher is making a transformational shift from maybe their current instructionally dominated classroom to one that is based off of students demonstrating evidence of learning, we really work hard with the school leadership team and the district and the school teachers of understanding the strategic nature of that shift. But then the fun begins in beginning to do design professional development around those practices. So we do have a strategic framework on our website, and I can't show it here. Is we have a honeycomb change strategy element model, which really, again, it's a sort of a design thinking framework that we begin educators at the center about why it is that they're beginning this work. We look at those teaching and learning practices that begin to start to position students in greater control of the experience, and even more importantly, in understanding that learning, their demonstration of their learning is the currency to what we're about, this interchange, how those practices evolve, and eventually what structures and policies might be changed in their classroom. We designed a few different toolkits. We call them toolkits, but they're basically activities that where teachers redesign a particular practice or enhance a particular practice to have greater and greater control for student learning. And it can be as simple as providing more learner voice and choice in an upcoming unit of study or lesson, where teachers are maybe providing multiple methods for learning. To as complex as where whole teachers and systems are redesigning, for example, whole courses around recognizing anywhere, anytime learning or learning that's taking place outside of the classroom, outside of an instructor, and even outside of the school, where students are coming in and demonstrating proficiencies, and teachers are partnering with them to sort of be a guide and a facilitator of their experiences outside. So we have an array of some of those offerings, but really our intent at all of them are getting at the intent of what is the work in here, helping to make that transformational shift, and working alongside educators as they're shifting practices one at a time to sort of meet the needs of really the requirements of a competency-based education system, is designing this where all students are demonstrating understanding versus experiencing just an instructional design.
Thanks, Ryan. I think we're going to try again to see if we can get a question posed directly from our audience. Kim, do you want to give that a try? I know you had a question for one of our guest speakers.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Ken.
All right.
Technology prevails. Thanks, Kim.
Excellent. Kim Carter here in New Hampshire. I work with QED Foundation, which is a nonprofit supporting this work and providing technical assistance, and run a couple of small schools that are committed and have been committed to this kind of work for the last 15 years. Ryan, I'm particularly intrigued by what you're talking about with the investigating the iterations, or actually I think you called it pieces of exposure that students need to have to begin to develop these skills and take on the role of co-designer. Could you say more about that, and is any of that research available publicly? Thanks.
Hello, Kim. Thanks for the question, and great question. So those are the next questions that we're posing based off of our initial research. We did some research in partner with UW-Madison. They have a PIP study, which is Practices in Personalized Learning. And our initial study was just to start to find and study. We studied 12 schools where some of this work was happening for personalized learning or competency-based education at the heart of it. and in particular looked at the role where students were in, where they had these, and we clearly saw that these schools or these practices had a nice correlation with co-development skills. And while we couldn't prove them at first, but there was themes there. There was definitely a difference in the role that the learner had because of some of these practices. And so while we saw that as a side thing during our initial study, our next time around we really want to study the amount of exposure that students are getting in environments to some of these practices and how that might relate to the development of some of these practices. So I mentioned before, so an example of that is let's say a teacher is providing students with multiple instructional methods and modes, or they're really giving students opportunity to select how they're going to learn something frequently, hoping that students are able to self-assess their own learning style, advocate for their own needs in learning, and sort of take on that role of the co-designer of their learning experience. One of our questions is how much are we watching students really develop the identity of a co-designer or these co-development skills, and is there a connection between the frequency or exposure that they're getting, so that what we're hoping to do is be able to have a deeper, richer story around how many times students need to be in the position in this role, which we think needs to be consistently in this role, but we want to see how often, so that as teachers are doing goal setting practices in their classroom or providing student choice, how frequently do we want that to happen, and what is the quality of practice around that. So we don't have any research on it yet because that's the next version of our research, but we do have a number of stories around here of watching this. Again, as the webinar said earlier, the levels of variation. We want to see if we can sort of bring some clarity to that variation and be maybe clearer with students need to be able to select how they learn. Is it every time? Is it half the time? Is it every class? And we just want to get some greater story around that. I don't know if that helps with your question.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to some really important pieces that are going to have layers to them, because I think all of what you just said is going to be critical. And I've certainly found that to be true over my last 20 years of doing this. And I find there are differences across different populations of students too. So it's almost like we need a learning progression for the role of co-designer. So thanks, Ryan. I'll look forward to hearing more about your work.
Totally agree that learning progression is exactly, I think, what we're hoping to bring some eyes to. So thank you.
So this is Wendy, and it looks like we're just about out of time. I want to take a moment to thank so many people who helped make today's webinar possible. First, to our guest speakers, Paul Leather from the Department of Education in New Hampshire, Ryan Krohn from the Institute of Personalized Learning, our research team. We have Jill Walston, we have Catherine Bitter, Chrissy Zeisser, Lauren Clymer. And to our funder, we have Eve Goldberg, Director of Research from Nellie Mae Education Foundation, who's on the line, Adriana Martinez, who's from CCSSO. And thanks to Nellie Mae, very soon the surveys that we developed for this study will be publicly available. And Lauren Clymer will be organizing the dissemination of these surveys. She has put her email in the general chat box. If you have any interest in being part of piloting or using these surveys, please be in touch with Lauren. And I want to thank everyone so much for taking an hour away from the election to join us today. And we will be in touch. We'll be sending out a link with some additional materials that Paul will be providing, a link to our recording. And we want to thank everyone so much for joining us today. Thank you.